So hello and welcome to our conference, The Next Normal, Engaging Schools with Stories of War and Conflict. My name is Charlotte and I work for Imperial War Museums, managing the War and Conflict Subject Specialist Network. The network brings together more than 500 organisations and individuals around the world who look at conflict from the First World War to the present day. And I'm really pleased to welcome Steve to speak in this session all about multisensory activities and Zoom object handling. So to introduce our speaker, Stephen Bogle. So Stephen is the Access and Learning Officer at the Devil's Porridge Museum in Dumfries and Galloway. Stephen has been in his current role at the museum since March of 2019 and has recently completed his M.Phil in Education Philosophy at the University of Glasgow. So welcome, Steve, and I'd like to hand over to you.
Hi there. I'll start just by saying hello, and then I'll quickly share my screen so that everyone can see what we've got. And it also means I'm looking at my PowerPoint rather than looking at a bank of faces waiting for me to speak. So yeah, my name's Stephen Bogle. I'm the Access and Learning Officer at the Devil's Porridge Museum. And we're going to talk a little bit about our COVID adapted collaboration that we've had. Now, I think obviously the first place to start is probably with the burning question of what is the Devil's Porridge Museum? Because although it's a subject specialist network, I'm sure not everyone has come across us, and it's a little bit of an unusual name. So at the Devil's Porridge, we tell the story of a place called HM Factory Gretna. Now, this was a factory site that existed during World War I for the purposes of making cordite as a propellant for shells. Now, they call it the greatest factory on earth, and that's because at the time it was the largest factory the world had ever seen it. It was 9 miles long, it was 2 miles wide. At its height, it employed 30,000 workers, most of whom, or at least half of whom, were young women working in the munitions industry. The scale of the factory, it was so great that they built 2 whole townships to support the workers for accommodation. They built cinemas, dance halls, hospitals, about half dozen different churches. And on top of that, they built 125 miles of railway within this, and everything was moved around the factory site with steamless locomotives. And it was quite an undertaking. It was built all in about 18 months. And we tell the story of the mostly young women who came to work here and their contribution to the war effort. We then also go into the home front and the Solway military coast during World War II, but predominantly we focus on HM Factory Gretna, and our collaboration that I would like to tell you about today focuses on HM Factory Gretna and the role of young women as well. Now, the name is always intriguing, and people always want to know why it's called the Devil's Porridge. Well, at the time, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was working as a war correspondent for the Times, and amongst many other people, he came to visit the factory to see the greatest factory on earth. And while he was here, he saw a scene he described as young women in Scotland making something white and lumpy in these giant pots. And you can see the Thomson night rating pan that they were using. And he commented that he thought it looked like porridge. And it's kind of a little bit unclear whether it was one of the girls or perhaps Conan Doyle himself who claimed that only the devil would want to eat this sort of porridge because it's so dangerous, it's so explosive. The girls themselves went on to have some of them had dreadful health conditions later in life. That only the devil would want this porridge, and he wrote that into his article, and the name kind of stuck from there, and we became the Devil's Porridge. So when we started the museum 25 years ago, with a really committed group of volunteers, many of whom are still involved and part of our board of trustees, they chose the Devil's Porridge as their name. Now, the collaboration I'm going to expand on involves a group called the Arts End of Somewhere. And to give you a little bit of background on the Arts End of Somewhere, They're a multi-sensory storytelling collective, is how they would term themselves. And you can see many of the young people that are involved on the screen here. Now, they all have or require additional sport needs, and they work at making multi-sensory stories to allow other people who are perhaps experiencing similar barriers to access cultural heritage to do so in a way that's appropriate for them. Now, they've worked on a number of projects in our local area around Dumfries and Galloway with other organisations. And I was invited along to one at Ellisland Farm, the home of Robert Burns. And I saw the performance, and then spoke to them afterwards for a while. And what they do, and this is their kind of tried and tested formula, is that they visit the historic property or the museum or the cultural heritage organisation, and they look around and they kind of pick topics that interest them and they start to research them. And from there, they build this multi-sensory story where they write the kind of the dialogue or the script, and they come up with different ways to include multi-sensory props. Like I say, they've done many of these in our local area. It's quite a tried and tested method. So we spoke that day and we decided that we would like to do a Devil's Porridge one. And that was early February. And then March came around when we were ready to start our project, and suddenly everything shut down around us. One of their big concerns was that the young people involved were particularly vulnerable to feeling isolated during a lockdown. So we wanted to work out a way that we could continue to engage with them and they could continue to interact with each other as well. And we chose to see the lockdown not so much as a barrier that had halted our work, but an opportunity for us to think slightly differently and try and come up with different ways and different approaches that would still meet everybody's needs. And we kind of identified those three needs as being that it needed to feel genuine. It needed to be led by the young people involved in the arts end of somewhere, and be very much kind of an in-reach process rather than an outreach, where they came to us and they helped shape our process rather than us dictating to them what we felt was the best approach. It needed to be individual still. It still needed to fit their requirements or desire for them to find aspects of the story that spoke to them individually and engage with that aspect of the museum. And we wanted to make sure that there was a follow-up, that we didn't simply fall into doing standalone sessions, but there was a connection between the sessions and that we were building towards not so much an end outcome, but a lasting involvement with the museum. So we started doing Zoom calls with them. They were meeting regularly by this point via Zoom anyway, by the time we decided that we'd start doing that, going down that route as well. Obviously, at first, when the lockdown came in, we thought that, as I'm sure many people did, that we'd have a couple of weeks. We'd maybe be locked down through April, and then we'd be back up and running. And as it became clear that it was going to be a longer transition, we started engaging more, or engaging with the group via Zoom, and we had almost weekly chats where we met up. And you can see me down the bottom there with a couple of our dolls that some of our volunteers knitted, who were keen to be involved in some multi-sensory storytelling as well. Now, throughout our museum, we have two characters called Ruby and Harry. And the storytellers really latched onto that, and they wanted to tell Ruby's tale. So we started following predominantly the role of the munitions workers, the female munitions workers. And we looked through our collection and could see what we could show them, what we could share with them, what we could scan and email across other resources we had, so that they could start to think about the stories and start to think about their research. Now, the other aspect that we used to help them explore the museum independently at first was our virtual guide on our website, where they can negotiate through all the galleries and have a 360-degree view. And while it's not great for reading some of the smaller text, it allowed them to get a feel of the flow of the building and some of the larger objects that we have on display. And we use this very much as a basis to decide what aspects of it interested them and what we could then follow up with. Now, it seems really odd to say that we had online object handling sessions. And that was quite a large barrier at first. Even thinking now when you can't physically pass objects between multiple people in a group without sanitizing them, object session handling is even harder when it's through a screen. But they were very keen that if we didn't end the lockdown, they'd be able to share the story online with each other and with other people through Zoom and things like that. So we started thinking about our object handling based on what I could show them from the museum and how we could describe texture and weight and shape and feel and how they could replicate that at home. In their regular performances or in-person performances, they would create the objects as replicas and then they would hand them around the audience. So they still wanted to be able to have that aspect where they could share what they were experiencing, what they were touching, what they were feeling with other people. And we thought if they had it at home or if I had something at home that replicated this feel, there was a good chance that somebody else would as well. And one of the things they latched onto from, which you can perhaps see in the previous photo, is that the hat from the women's uniforms as munition workers looked awfully like shower caps. So people would regularly wear shower caps as part of the sessions as their way of representing the uniform. Like people feel the elastic around their head as a headband. And we moved on like that. Pardon me. This then led onto being able to show objects within the collection and within our storeroom. So from the virtual tour and from their research, they identified aspects they would like to look at further. And the gas masks were quite key to this. Now, these are obviously World War II ones with Operation Pied Piper in the background and the evacuees. But what we could then do is we could take my phone or a tablet on Zoom and we roamed around the museum so that we could look more closely at objects that they'd identified from the virtual tour and just have another way of interacting with them that wasn't necessarily sat at a desk talking to them, but it was a little bit more free flow and we could explore different parts of the building. Now, through all of this, they were still generating our multi-sensory story, but it allowed us to extend it from being one or two isolated sessions to something that we could build into a bigger program. And we're still meeting up quite regularly and chatting about other things that they've come across, other parts of their research. And we're doing that as we hope to build towards having the multi-sensory story live in the museum, which is our ultimate goal once, I don't want to say back to normal, but once that becomes possible. And that's kind of very much where we're at the moment with this project, is that we're coming to a theatre or a museum venue soon to tell Ruby's life in World War II. Now, based on this, we've then taken this concept and moved it into our schools program, because we obviously can't have school visits at the moment either, or schools seem less willing to come. But we're following up with assemblies that then from the idea of the pupils or the classes doing their own individual research and then coming back to us so that we can take a closer look at different aspects of the museum that they're interested in and how we can then also build in our online object handling. And that's really how our collaboration throughout the COVID lockdown has impacted our schools program and how it's allowed us to kind of think slightly differently and hopefully come up with some interesting solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve, for giving us an insight into this wonderful project, but also how you face the challenges that COVID presents, and thinking of new ways of working, which I think has been a really strong theme of the conference today. So thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.